This week, we're talking about a ministry called Overseed and how it supports pastors and their spouses in New England. We'll be talking with Dr. Jim Harrell. Jim is the president of Overseed and one of the founders, and he and his wife, Sharon Harrell, who's the field director for their pastor's wives ministry. I'm Charles Galdi, your host for the Church in Action. Jim, Sharon, thanks for being with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Here.
Could you guys could one or both of you guys take turns or however you want to do it, but give us a little bit of bio for each of you, and then we'll talk about Overseed.
Sure. I'll let Sharon go first, and then I'll tell you a little about me.
All right.
Great.
So I grew up on the west coast of California, and then I transitioned to Vermont when I was about age 13. I met Jim at the University of Vermont, where we were involved with the campus ministry called the Navigators. And basically, ministry's been our shared passion from the day we met. I think we were doing washing dishes and realized that we both had this shared passion for ministry. And it's just, I've never realized that it's probably been one of the greatest blessings of my life has been being a ministry wife. And a lot of times people think that is a challenge. So it's just kind of fun to think back over that. We've been married for 45 years. In August, I was a stay-at-home mom for about 18 of those years. And then God gave me a career in financial aid for about 21 of those years. We have 3 children, 5 grandchildren, and we're just blessed that they still want to be nearby.
That's great. And so they're all in Massachusetts near you guys.
Basically, yeah.
Nice.
Well,
And
good.
Yeah.
I was fortunate to grow up in the church. I went to church before I was born. You know, God was a regular part of life. I went to the University of Vermont, where I ran into the Navigators, who began to disciple me and began to address the frustrations that I felt growing up in the church. Didn't really seem like the church was doing what the church should be doing. So we were involved with the Navs at Vermont, moved to Miami. I was on staff with them in Tennessee. Then God called us out of the Navigators, back partly to New Jersey. Where'd we go? Virginia, then back to Vermont. Was involved in a church plant, was involved in church revitalization. Always was bivocational for most of my ministry. So I did technology to pay the bills, did my MDiv at Gordon College, and I went back and did my doctorate at Gordon Conwell, did my doctorate there. And so it's been, like I say, technology was fun, but ministry is what we love.
Now, technology is fun some of the time.
Yes.
I've said before, when it's breaking, I just go, all technology is of the devil. And so now the both of you are part of the Overseed ministry, and so maybe let's start with just how did Overseed start? What is Overseed?
Well, sure. Overseed started technically in 2008, but really it goes back to earlier than that. I had been approved by Converge to go into church planting. We went through their 4-day torture test, and that was the trajectory we were on.
4-day equipping panel.
Yes. Affectionately known as torture. No. And I actually loved those 4 days. You know, it tells you something about me. But then I decided to finish seminary. I'd done a lot of study of the Bible, but you don't know what you don't know. So I did distance seminary through Bethel for 1.5 years, and then we moved down to Massachusetts to finish at Gordon Conwell. And while we were there, started attending a mainline church on the North Shore that had been revitalized in the late 60s, early 70s. And as I got to know the pastor, like I never even heard the term. Like I didn't even know what he was doing. And as I got to know him, I got intrigued by that idea. At first thought it was ridiculous, but then the more I thought about it, I realized, revitalization's been part of the church since like the Corinthian church. And so I realized, hey, there's a lot here I don't know. Bunch of things happened. And in the spring of 2006, I was a youth group leader at the time because my kids were in it and they needed help. And so I took the youth group to the Boston Project in Dorchester, which is mostly a college ministry, but they'd let us come during spring break. And so we could go on a mission trip for like $50 a kid. And so that was fun. And while I was down there one morning, We were sleeping on the floor of a Baptist church in the middle of Dorchester. And one morning about 5 o'clock, I couldn't sleep. I needed coffee. So I got up. And as I was walking down the street, there was no traffic, nothing. The city was dead. I was actually walking down the middle of the street because I could, trying to find a Dunkin' Donuts. And I went a couple of blocks and I came to this five-way intersection. And across the street was a UCC church that probably seated 400, 500 people, trying to raise $12,000 to fix the roof. And I thought, there's probably 20 people in this church.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, if I was going to plant a church in Dorchester, where would I do it? And I could see a movie theater. I
Mm.
could see this huge mansion. You could probably buy for $5 million and convert it to a church. I saw a couple of strip malls, and I got thinking, well, if they're not going to use that church very well, maybe I could, figure out a way to I didn't have language for it. I thought, well, maybe replant that church there. And God spoke to me in the middle of that intersection at 5:30 in the morning, saying, "This is what I want you to figure out." And I thought, well, that's weird. I don't
Mm.
even know what you want me to figure out,
Yeah.
but I'm
Yeah.
in. And so that started a journey of I started meeting with that pastor, like, explain this concept to me. And then I went and did my doctorate in revitalization. And, I Googled, like, how do you revitalize a church in 2008? And all I got was building companies and seed companies. Like, nobody was talking about it at the time. So we just started down this journey. Like, how would we do it? And my background, my passion's always been how to fix problems and how to develop people. And I thought, well, people are people. So if the church is declining, obviously there's a deficiency of belief in the gospel and nobody's developing people.
Mm.
So I figured the best way to revitalize churches is got to start with the pastor and the leaders. And so we began down that journey, and we had a lot of false starts, but that's how it started in the
Mm.
middle of Main Street in Dorchester.
And so, would you say today Overseed is a revitalization ministry, or has it expanded beyond that to do some other things too before we talk about pastors and spouses?
Yeah, I would say it's really about helping the church move forward,
Mm.
regardless of the starting point. And in New England, some of those starting points are really bad,
Mm.
and some of them are not so bad. So we realized that we wanted local coaching, we wanted local cohorts so guys could get to know one another, encourage one another. And that meant we were kind of putting guys together who had churches at different starting points and realized they're all kind of working on the same thing, different problems in the church. So it's really about intentionally moving the church forward is really our focus.
And it sounds like one of the key ways you're doing that is by putting pastors and cohorts together where they journey along being developed as leaders, being developed as pastors, developing their spiritual life. Is that am I
Yes.
catching it right?
So yeah, go ahead.
No, no, I was just going to go ahead.
So on the pastor side, we have a 5-year model of really focusing on core competencies. So we want pastors to get together and develop friendships in the local area. We want to raise the spiritual health of pastors in a local community. So the first part of the cohort is just relational. How are you doing? What's God doing? What's the problem or challenges you have? They have to, report on how they're moving the church forward each month. And then we also wanted pastors to learn how to think about the ministry. Rather than just reacting to what's happened, how do we be intentional? How do we respond? And so we focus on 5 core competencies, both in terms of how to think about it and then also skill sets. So we focus on how do you lead your church? How do you make disciples in your church? How do you develop leaders in your church? How do you shepherd people privately? How do you preach the gospel privately? And then preaching, which is really more communication, not so much exegesis. But what we realized is, you could Google any of these topics and be overwhelmed with data. And so we wanted to provide a model where pastors could discuss and soak in a topic for a whole year so that they're actually making progress. So all the contents basically, if there's anything to absorb, it's absorbed prior to the cohort, and the cohorts are really all discussion based. Let's wrestle with this content, and then at 5 years they can decide, do was that great, going to do something else, do we want to sell divide, or do we want to keep going? So we actually have a second 5 years that kind of goes deeper in those competencies if they want to do that.
And so, Jim, so we're getting together as pastors and we're discussing this. Is there a coach who's the more seasoned person as part of this, or is it pure peer learning?
They're all coach led.
Okay.
And again, and I wanted local coaching because so much of pastoring is culture.
Hmm.
And Fairfield County is a lot different than New Hampshire versus northern Maine. Like, even though New England has its own separate culture,
Yeah.
even parts of state are radically different.
Yeah.
So, I could Skype with someone in northern Maine, I'd get the pastoring right, but if I get the culture wrong,
Yeah.
I could blow up the church. So I really wanted local coaches. So we have a network of coaches around New England. We like 2 coaches per cohort if possible. And so we have about 25 coaches, about 19 cohorts going right now. We're hoping to launch another 4 or 5 in the fall.
And who are some names folks might not? I don't want you to run through your whole coaches list, but just to give folks, because it's a beefy, seasoned group. And so, who are some of those folks?
Jack Daniel, who was at Free Christian Church for 35 years. Steve Tresh, who just retired from BlackRock. Dennis Gill, who some people know on the North Shore. Um, let's see, people that people would know. Those are probably some names that are fairly seasoned New England veterans.
And I think about some of the other ones that I know. It's like they're all almost all, if not all, decades in ministry and
Yes,
pastoral ministry.
yes,
Yeah, and have been through the good times and the bad and the easy times where you think you're a genius and the hard times where you think you're an idiot, right?
absolutely, absolutely. And so, it's designed for coaches to speak in when necessary, but really, it's a lot of it is peer to peer. What do we wrestle with? How can we help each other? How can we pray for each other? Let's kind of wrestle these topics through.
And so it sounds like you've got a curriculum each year they're going through, where I'm assuming they're reading some books or articles, stuff like that, and then the discussion is we get together and talk about that.
Yeah. So each curriculum is 9 months. So we meet September through May. It's New England. No one meets in the summer. Even if they say they want to, they don't come. Um, and so there is a monthly coaches guide that our coaches use, that provides the content. And either we read a book or we use white papers each month.
Okay. And how big is a typical cohort?
The ideal size is 6. It varies from 4 to 8, but because we want it to be discussion based, once you get beyond 6, that gets a lot harder.
And to your point about context or culture being so important, it's geographically based. So I'm not traveling 4 hours to get to my cohort. It's not Zoom based. We're getting in a room
Yeah.
most of the time, at least, and talking to each other because it's drivable.
Yep. It's all local cohorts.
And so that's what you're doing with pastors. And now, Sharon, you've stepped in and you've started a ministry within Overseed for pastors' wives. And so, is it pastors' wives or spouses? I should make
It's
clear.
it's a good question. We wrestle with that all the time. We have started with pastor wives just because we're small, and that seems to be the ones that I can get a hold of. So
Well, it's a logical extension of the pastors in Overseed, isn't it?
exactly, exactly.
Yeah. And
So
I know you do
that's
have
what we
women
did.
pastors who've been in Overseed, so it's just there's not many, there's not as many, right?
Right,
Correct. Yeah.
right.
And so, what are you looking to do? Why did you start it? What are you doing? Why are you doing it?
Those are great questions. Basically, pastor wives have been on our hearts since day one that Overseed was started. And it just was not a time that we could do it. So 3 years ago, God allowed me to retire from my financial aid career, and I was able to focus on this ministry. So I took a year to do R&D and figure out what we needed to do to make a sustainable model that will refresh and renew and refocus the pastor wives that are serving in New England.
Mm. Yeah, no, Ruth Calver, who I know you guys know, she used to over in the UK when Clive, her husband, ran the Evangelical Alliance. She routinely had something that she called Living with Leadership, which was a workshop and session she did. Because while it is that great blessing you were talking about, there's some real challenges in it, especially in living with pastoral leadership.
Yes.
And so now is it a similar model as Jim has talked about for pastors where there's coaches and cohorts, or is it something different?
It's obviously different. These wives don't have a job that they have to do, so there aren't these skill sets that they need.
Mhm.
However, there are things that they all wrestle with together. So basically, it's a cohort of maybe about 8 to 10 women, and we've tried to start local as well. And we may need to go somewhat Zoom just because of the logistics of getting pastor wives together is a little more difficult than getting pastors together. So it's a combination of either in person or Zoom, depending on the logistics.
And so we have a lot of pastors we know, and this isn't true of all pastors, but we know a lot of pastors feel isolated, certainly
Mhm.
at times. And so what Jim is doing can certainly speak to that if folks want to step into it. But I have this perception that pastors' wives can even be more isolated. Is that
Well,
fair?
yes, it is. There's a leadership isolation that comes from being a pastor wife. Just, you're different than everybody else in the congregation in some ways. In some ways, you're the same. And that can cause confusion and isolation. But then you put a pastor wife in New England where there's not a cultural similarity to being a believer. And so it's just harder to find relationships. In fact, I just had a pastor wife tell me a story how a young believer told her, well, if everybody in our church is transitional, you really should just get together with other pastor wives to have those kinds of long-term relationships.
No.
So it really is the one place in New England where a pastor wife can have some long-term relationships.
Yeah, we'll talk sometimes about how consumer driven so many of us are in church, where we have the pastor's job description is whatever I decide he needs to do to serve me, or he or she needs to do. But
Yeah.
then the flip side is we have them even less spoken of the expectations of the pastor's wife. And I remember an intern pastor at a church we were at years ago, a pastor named Doug Aldrich. His last sermon was, "Here's what you're going to do to these people, and don't do it." And he would talk about it, and he'd say, so if the pastor's wife sits up front, you're going to say, wow, she's really showy. And if she sits in the back, you're going to say she doesn't really support his ministry very well. And it was like, and he just laid out one thing after another. She can't win.
Right.
Yeah. I need a copy of that.
I wish I had it. It was so long ago, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's
The
really good.
and so it sounds like that's what you're finding with pastors' wives too. Is there's
Yeah.
all these expectations that isolate, and the friendships that are challenging,
Yeah.
and so what do you? So are you just trying to create friendship and space for them?
No, because I think one of the other things that they want is they want coaches. They want
Mhm.
somebody to come alongside them and hear how they're wrestling, how to work out their faith in love next to that leader, which
Okay.
has its own complications. So our coaches are also decade long pastor
Mhm.
wives. They've been through it all, but they're there to walk alongside, to ask questions, to help the wives wrestle through the unique challenges they have. It's probably one of the biggest things that the pastor wives who are in our cohorts have appreciated. They will set up one-to-one times with the coaches, and but they also have that camaraderie, which is huge.
Mhm.
But there's also a wisdom that comes from sharing practical ideas with one another. It's like I've heard wives go, "Oh, I never thought to do it that way."
Mhm.
It's just like there's that sense of when you're doing the same thing, whether it's a job or a role or whatever it is, it's just helpful to have those conversations and get that shared wisdom.
Now, my assumption is that it's easier to get wives to engage in something like this than it is to get husbands, because guys, we may feel isolated, but we do it to ourselves sometimes, whereas women know they want relationship and are actually willing to do something about it. Is that
That is
accurate, or
a
am I off?
really interesting perspective, which I thought would be true as well. But we have
Hmm.
found that there are barriers for wives. I think we've talked about them and try to remember some of them, but just the idea that they're already exhausted relationally.
Mm.
So to come to something and have to be relational again is a barrier.
Hmm.
There's logistics, there's time logistics, there's some of them work, some of them don't, some of them have young kids. So just trying to come up with a time for them to do it, and then for them to be willing to ask their husband to sacrifice some of his time so that they can go to do this is another barrier. It's just, you just keep adding them. It really is kind of amazing.
Yeah, it's not clear that husbands understand their wives need something like
Right.
this. Because we've raised it a couple of times at Vision New England. Should we do something for the wives of this group, or the spouses of this group? And the ones in the group are always like, nah, I don't think they need anything. I'm like, okay.
Well, the other thing that Sharon has in conjunction with some other folks, that they've designed the cohorts to be a
Right.
guided discussion. So it's
Mm,
not just come and let's all just make this
hang
up
out.
as we go along. It's actually it's around a topic that is relevant, and the coaches
Mm.
kind of guide that discussion. So again, there's a chance to think something through with other pastor spouses and
And
wives.
that kind of goes back to one of the other barriers is there are pastor wives who won't go to a pastor wife thing because it's always been depressing when they've
Mm.
gone, because
Hmm.
it's been just a gripe session. And
Oh,
so our conversations are kind of an elevated conversation. Somebody equated it to they're pop-up questions. They're questions you would want to ask, but you're not gonna.
oh, yeah.
And so it allows them to have the discussion without having to bring it up, without having to go into the details.
Now, you raise the issue of I'm going to have to be willing to give time for either one of these, but that's true of anything good, right? It takes time. Is there a dollar cost associated with this, or do you guys rely on donations to offset all of your costs?
Yeah,
Yes.
so we don't charge for the pastor cohorts or the pastor spouse cohorts. I mean, half these guys don't even get paid a living wage. Like, there's no way we're going to charge them to help them become better. We don't do a lot of church coaching. When we do, we do charge for that. But for the pastors and the spouses, this is all volunteer, and
Meaning, if
we
I if
rely
I
on donations.
sorry, Jim. So, meaning if I reached out to you and I said, "Hey, I need help beyond the cohort. I need you to come here and do some stuff in my church." That's an offering you guys have, but you charge differently for something like that.
Yes.
Okay. And so maybe share without attributing names to it, if that wouldn't be appropriate. What for both in the pastors cohorts and the wives cohorts? What are some things you've seen God do in them?
Yeah. You want me to go first, Sharon, or do you want to go?
Um, well, I was thinking of one right off the top of my head is just a couple of the wives this last year. I just realized they're starting to talk more about the ministry, which is just a delight to my heart. Just that they're starting to feel like, oh, I have things to offer here.
Oh, wow, neat,
Yeah.
neat. That's great. Jim, what about on the pastor side?
Well, on the big picture, I mean, Barna's stat is 40% of pastors don't make it to 5 years,
Mm.
80% don't make it to 10.
Mm,
Personally, I think that's high, but let's say it's 30 and 70, whatever it is, horrible statistics.
yeah,
And we've seen of the pastors that are in our cohorts, about 98% are still in ministry.
yeah.
So there's, because New England, longevity is a big deal on so many fronts, and especially in the pastorate. So if we're going to revitalize a church and the guy leaves after 4 years, we all lose. So long,
Which is typical, right? 4 years is a typical pastorate.
and it doesn't work in New England. And
Yeah.
so we're seeing guys stay. And really, by the time you get to year 7, 8, oftentimes that's when it starts to be fun. So all they do is go through all the hard times over and over and over again. So that's at a big picture. Individually, one of the things I noticed during COVID was, even though it was horrible for every pastor known to man, the ones in the cohort were generally encouraged because they had they had a way to move forward. It was slow, but they could talk with people, they could brainstorm together, they could be intentional. And so they were just healthier.
Yeah.
And then over time, just watching guys begin. I mean, pastoring is so hard. I mean, you got to preach every Sunday. You got to develop lead. I mean, you're supposed to be the jack of all trades on steroids. But watching these guys make progress, both in areas where they're strong, but even areas where they're weak, or being able to come along someone and say, hey, look, we got to do this. Not me, but I'll help you do it. So we're seeing the pastors be encouraged, and we're also seeing just the health of the churches begin to rise as as they learn how to do things like, okay, how do you have a difficult conversation, and how do you do it well so that it's sanctifying versus you're all ready to kill each other.
And so we started out talking about revitalization, but you don't have to be a pastor in a revitalization situation to take advantage of what Oversee does.
No, as long as you want to move your church forward, that's the caveat. And
And
and our cohorts are 3 hours a month. So, there's a time commitment. There is some prep work, not a ton.
yeah.
But if you're intentional about developing yourself and developing your church, you're welcome.
And just to be clear on the wife side, the pastor doesn't have to be participating in Oversee for the wife to be able to participate in
No,
Oversee, right?
no,
And so when we just saw the data that came out from was, I think, Lifeway did this and said half of Protestant churches have grown since the pandemic, and it was and that growth was very skewed towards what we call put in that evangelical bucket theologically. And so do you guys look at stuff like, I don't want to make the argument that numerical growth is an indicator of success in ministry, because that's just flat out wrong.
Right.
But are you seeing things that like
yeah.
spiritual growth and numerical growth, or how does that look in your cohorts?
God seems to be doing something in the last 2 years. I mean, I'm regularly hearing stories of people starting to show up at church. Like I was just talking to a pastor in Vermont, and in the last 3 months, they've had like 10 couples visit their little church.
Yeah.
And they're local, but they're not coming from Christian backgrounds.
Yeah.
And so I just regularly hear stories of, like one guy, this random guy, and their church isn't on a main thoroughfare, but somehow this guy found their church, came in the front door, asked to talk to the pastor, knocked on the door and said, hey, can you tell me about this Jesus stuff? And, so those things are happening all over the place, not by the thousands,
Yeah.
but just this incremental spiritual interest. And I think some of it was COVID. I think some of it's the political landscape. Some of it is God's just at work.
Yeah, I think I hear that same thing, Jim. It's interesting. And it's stuff. Well, new people always came to church, right? It's just, but what I hear from pastors is it's different now. It's like a surprise if a guy just knocks at the door. There's a pastor up here who's telling me a story. I'm in New Hampshire, as you guys know. The pastor up here is telling me a story about 4 teenage boys showed up one Sunday and said, we think we're supposed to be going to a church. Can we come here? And like,
wow.
Right. Who and 2 months later, they're getting baptized, and there's 20 other teenage boys sitting in the front pews with their phones, capturing these kids getting baptized. It's just, that's not normal, what we consider normal, right? And so I think you're right. I think God's doing something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so thank you so much. Not just for taking time to talk to us today, but for all of the ministry you do in and through Oversee and the other ways I know you minister as well. I'm grateful for your making the investment in pastors and their wives, because if we don't have healthy leadership, right, we're not going to have healthy churches. We don't have healthy churches, we can't have healthy communities. That's just the way it works.
Exactly.
And so thank you both for doing that, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you,
thanks, Charles. Appreciate it a lot.
Bless you both.
Thank you.
To support this program and accelerate evangelism, go to visionNewEngland.org and click on Donate, or click Member to become a partner with us. This program is supported by the Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.
At Leadership Transformations, We believe that when you have the right resources to help you slow down and experience a deep and refreshing connection to God, you can become the discerning leader you know you are created to be. Friends, Steve Macchia here, and I have a free gift for your soul. It's called Pathways. Pathways is our weekly email aimed at offering you soul-nourishing content for the journey. It contains readings, prayers, spiritual practices, a link to the Discerning Leader podcast, as well as information about all of our upcoming soul care retreats, workshops, and online offerings. So head on over to leadershiptransformations.org today and sign up for this free resource. It will help you slow down and be more. God bless you, friends.